Hello everybody, how are you all doing? Hope you're doing good. In this painting video, I'm going to be talking you through this painting I've done of a white horse called Chalkie. Chalkie is this horse at my sister's riding school that she helps out at, and he is just her absolute favourite horse of all time. And for the past year or so, my sister's been asking me to do a drawing portrait of Chalkie, which I haven't quite been able to do. I've really struggled with that whole thing because the composition in my brain hasn't worked for that whatsoever. And I've also, white horse, white paper, it just didn't work for me. So even after reaching out to artists like Bonnie Snowden, who is an absolute animal portrait master at drawing, I still couldn't get it. She gave me some amazing tips that I have implemented into the painting, but I just couldn't work out how to do it for a drawing. But she's a master at portrait animals, and I'll leave a link to her social media in the description below. But for the painting itself, I thought it'd be such a fun idea to do this painting for my sister's birthday. I've painted it in oils, and collecting the reference material was actually a really big challenge because my sister is at these stables so often it's quite hard to find a time she's not there. I went there and collected some reference materials, got a few photos, and eventually I stumbled on this photo. And this photo I just absolutely fell in love with because for this painting and everything, some of you might know my other artworks are very much detail based and very much realistic based and looking and everything, but for this painting I really wanted to look at how light worked and how light formed this amazing three-dimensional creature and everything about it. I just love how the light fell on this reference photo. So I thought that was the best photo I could possibly find, and I've used that. And everything about this has been so much fun to create, and it's just been so fun to do, and I hope you all enjoy this video. I shall by now you've had enough of looking at my face, so we'll just go straight into the video. So, just as I do for pretty much every drawing or painting I do, I always start out with doing these thumbnail sketches, and thumbnail sketches are just, I draw 3 boxes on an A4 sheet of paper that are very small, and I draw 1 extra box which is quite large, which is about the size of an A4 sheet of paper. I always start the very first thumbnail sketch as a very quick one. It takes maybe 30 seconds or less, and it's just to get an idea of the first ideas on how this composition will work in my head. I initially thought about adding in that wooden fence and gate, but I decided to scrap that idea very quickly because the whole composition didn't work. I wanted the painting itself to express freedom and express everything around that freedom idea and the light, but the fence just didn't work for that at all. So for this I always use a 2B pencil because I find it is so easy to just very quickly jot down things, very easy to change how much pressure you're putting on, and as you can see from the very first one to the third one I spend a little more time on each one developing the ideas and coming up with how everything works. And then for this fourth one, which is a much larger, pretty much A4 sheet of paper that I've drawn on, I do it much larger and get a really solid ground basis for the final outline. The final outline for this is what I'm drawing now, but it's the drawing that I will be transferring over to the canvas. The canvas was quite large. It was, I don't remember the exact measurements off the top of my head, but I had quite some issues with coming up with the composition for the neck, and that was erased a few times, but I eventually found one that really worked nicely. And I'm not going into details with the drawing, but I just put in some shadows, but I never transfer those shadows over onto the canvas. So here you can see we've transferred that sketch, a rough sketch drawing over to the canvas, and usually pretty much with all my paintings I will then do the outline. I'll go over the outline in blue paint usually, and just I find that helps me see and guide exactly where everything goes. And I always do this in acrylic because I find oil paints smudge sometimes because I don't have the patience for the drying time for doing a base layer and an underpainting. So once I've got everything sketched out, I will then do an undertone, which is usually a warm tone. This is done also in acrylics. It's just washed out burnt umber, which I do for the background, but in hindsight I definitely should have gone over the entire thing. But after reading a few books, I thought it might be quite a good idea to do the horse in a different colour, which would be a much warmer colour, because once again I was really working from this light and I wanted to achieve light, which is also why I'm using the blue tones, because I wanted it to both have cool and warm light, which is definitely a very, very challenging thing to achieve with a white canvas, which is why I filled in absolutely everything in the horse in this dark orangey colour. And as you can see, I made a little bit of a mistake of where the horse's jawline ends, which I then correct a little later on. This section here, I'm just using brown and light brown that has been washed down with some fast drying medium. This is once again acrylic. I find doing acrylic for my undertone and my base layer, which is also known as the first layer, I just find it works a lot nicer compared to oil paints, because in my mind oil paints are always reserved for the highlights, the details and those tonal values. So once we've waited for that to dry, which is about 2 hours, maybe 3 all in all, I then have this idea that I want to create this vignette around, I think it's pronounced vignette but I could be wrong, around the horse and have that in the background. You might know this sort of technique from some old Rembrandt paintings where he's directing the viewer's eye line and the eye gaze to the subject itself. That is the whole purpose of using this technique, and anybody who does photography, it's also primarily used in photography. It's one of those things that you don't really notice, but it's always there. And so I used black for that, and I then mixed it in with some brown, creating these dark brown tones. And as you can see, I've missed the jawline there because I'm a moron, but I do go back and correct that and everything looks completely natural. So I'm starting with very dark tones on the outsides, and then as they move closer towards the subject itself, which is of course the horse, the tones get much lighter and more of this brown, because I love that old rusticy look and I thought it worked so well for Chalkie himself. After that, once again, I will go back using acrylics. These acrylics are not washed out and they don't have any medium implemented into them whatsoever, but this here I thought it was just all it is the first layer, putting down roughly where bits and bobs will go, not looking too much at shadows, but definitely also looking at the shadows. I know that sounds so confusing, but it's just giving me this rough idea, literally just to block in and fill in, get rid of all that yellow underpainting, and get a rough idea of where everything's going to go. So I painted in the mane, painted the ears. The ears was so much fun to do. Even though I did screw one of them up slightly, I then very easily corrected that later on. Everything about this section and this first layer is literally just putting on as much paint as I think is necessary, but not using thick layers, because as you can see, it's got transparency to it. That's what I really like about acrylics, is that they can be transparent for this first layer, and that still allows that warm light to come through. And for the colours, I only used white, lamp black and some cream, because when I looked closer at Chalkie's mane, he was very creamy mane, and I thought that was just a very big point I wanted to highlight, but I didn't want the mane to draw away the attention from himself, so I wanted most of the attention on the eye, but something I found out about horse eyes is that they have almost no reflection in them, which was such a sad thing for me to find out, because one of my favourite things to draw, one of my favourite things to paint are eyes. I love how they work and they're just amazing. So as you can see, I fixed the mistake I made with the background, and then from here I'm just setting down some high tones, low tones, and just, as you can see, just literally filling in the whole thing, and still not looking for details at all, because the whole painting was not about details for me in the slightest. It was just all about light and everything here. I'm looking at light. I'm looking at where the light is and where the low light is, the cool light, also known as warm and cool light. That was the whole purpose of the painting itself. This still is acrylic paints, and I'm just filling in the muzzle, nose. I'm not 100% what it's called, I'm not good with horse anatomy, but you can also see with the horse's eye, it's just this black blob that had no highlights and had absolutely nothing, and it was just black. So later on in the painting I do end up going back and putting in some highlights because it just needed it. I don't care what anybody says, it just needed it, no questions asked. So for all of this I'm using about a 1-inch dagger brush, which I find is quite easy to maneuver, quite easy to manipulate the paint into each crevice and crack that is needed. And then as I work through the painting and I get further and further along, looking at where the light and hair goes, I do switch to a much smaller brush. But as you can see, we're just about to switch over to the second layer, and for almost all of these layers I start with that left ear because I don't want my hand to be touching wet paint. So for the second layer I've used oil paints, and I always save my tonal best for last, which in this case would be unfiltered titanium white, which basically means there's no medium in that titanium white. And one of the most amazing things that I loved about this reference photo so much was this amazing blue tone that just showed on the horse's nose and the front of his nose so much. It was just absolutely beautiful to me. So that was something I really wanted to draw attention to, and I hope I've managed to draw quite a bit of attention to that nose and frontal section itself. That's the section I spent almost pretty much most of my time on, but you can see those blue tones look like grey tones, which is the thing that Bonnie Snowden actually taught me and suggested to me. Is one of the biggest things to remember is that what looks white is not actually white. There's always grey tones in there, there is always yellow tones in there, and there are always blue tones in there. Occasionally there'll be some purple tones, and that's one of the biggest things I did actually use in this painting itself, was remembering that this isn't actually white. It may look white, but all the different colours are blue and yellow and obviously white. I know it sounds very confusing, but that's how the shades are made, not just by mixing together black and white to create different tones of grey. Most of the shadow on the horse's face itself is primarily blue tones, cool tones, because warm and cool tones will counteract with one another, and they create those highlights and will show the definition of the horse's face. So I do go back and as you can see here, I will then put in a highlight on the horse's eye, because for me the eyes are the window to the soul and they just need to be alive. Everything else for this painting didn't have to be detailed and had to be the most realistic looking thing in the world, because it's not so much my goal to be a realism artist. It's a technique I love to do and I love to practice it, but I want to be an artist that isn't only focused on details but does explore different things within painting. I don't want to be settled into one specific niche. I love painting and I love drawing. I have an equal love for both of them. I'm just not as good at painting as I am at drawing because I've had more practice in drawing. But continuing on with this second layer, as you can see, I do spend quite some time on this nose and muzzle, and those blue tones are just so subtly hidden away in there that I feel they're both hidden away and subtle, but at the same time they pop out, they make the painting alive. All of these white tones that appear white are actually mixed in with a little bit of yellow oil paint, and a lot of it is also cream, because I found cream was such a lovely colour to use for the less prominent sections of the horse itself. So once I let that layer of oil paint dry, which took about 2 days because I was using fast drying medium, I then went back and I decided to put the background in oil paint, because acrylic for the background just didn't work 100%. It needed that extra bit of glossiness. So as you can see, the background just looks so much smoother. It looks almost silky to me, and I just love it so much, that background. Also using that Vignetti again. But then for this third layer, I'm now coming back, and you can really start to see those highlights coming in and really just popping out of the painting. And this is something I love to call the illusion of detail, and I've read so many books about this details and how to put details in, that I then eventually came across a book. I think it was called The Illusion of Detail, but it was definitely about how the brain will trick the viewer into thinking and seeing these details, even though they're not always there. So one of the biggest tricks for drawing and painting realism and details is focusing on the details. But this sort of painting, which looks like a realistic painting, all I'm focusing on is the light, and I'm looking at the contrast of where the light shadows are, the dark shadows are, where the light highlights are, and where the dark highlights are. That must be one of the most confusing things I've ever said in my entire life, but trust me, if you pick up some oil paints or painting and you get into painting just a little bit and you watch some videos, you very quickly seem to understand what I'm trying to get across to you. One of the biggest influences in painting for me is, for a contemporary artist, is definitely Andrew Tishler. He is one of my biggest idols in painting, and I just absolutely love his work so much. I'll definitely leave a link to his link to his social media in the description, because if you haven't heard of him or you haven't seen his videos, please go check his work out. He is just the biggest idol for me in painting. So this is continuing on with that third layer, and I don't always just work in one area and one section with any layer, because I don't work on it, finish it, move to the next layer for the next section as I do with drawing, because painting is so different compared to drawing. For one instance, almost everybody knows this, painting, you start dark and you work your way up lighter. With drawing, you start very light and you work your way to darker tones. But for this one, I'm working back and forth, different sections. You can see the painting itself just start to evolve. I wouldn't say start to come alive, but the lighting on it just really is prominent there. You can see where that sun is just hitting him onto the nose, and where those dark shadows are that are being formed by the roof and the windows. One thing I did find is that Chalkie is a very rugged horse. He's not a racehorse. He's not just sleek. A lot of him is very almost woolly, I would say. I'm sure there's an equestrian out there that knows exactly the word, and I'll be criticized for not using the proper words, but I'm not asking my sister because she'll know the surprise and everything. But As you can see, his hair, I come back to change his hair and I make his hair a little more silky, a little more smooth, because I felt it was just getting too much attention away from his face itself. And this thing here, you might know, is what artists use to rest their hand on if they feel their hand's too shaky. I can't remember the exact name for it at the moment, but I didn't have one near me. I didn't have a bit of wood that I could stick, that I could use, so I just got an old golf club, sawed off the head of it, and just used that because it worked. And then I use that for all the tiny little bits where if I move my paintbrush in the wrong way, it's going to screw up the whole thing and make it look really awful, but I don't use that for these much larger strokes here. And as you can see, the paintbrush itself, this is going back to a thing I mentioned a little while ago, where I've just moved down in size for the paintbrush quite a bit. And that neck, I love the neck so much for that. It adds the depth, it adds the contrast, and something I thought was a little odd was that horses have whiskers, which I didn't know about until I looked really closely at this reference photo, and I thought, yeah, he just needs them. Call me a detail freak, but it just needed them. But yes, I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Maybe you've learned something, or maybe you've just enjoyed listening to me ramble. I don't know, maybe you stuck me on mute so you could just watch the painting just paint itself. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked it, please leave a like, consider subscribing. Thank you very much.